Andrew, thanks for coming on the show. You have been traveling to Central Asia for the Ferghana Peace Forum. Can you tell us a little about what you saw and why you think it was an important event?
Absolutely. I mean, great to be back here, Jacob. Appreciate you having me back on. The Ferghana Peace Forum was the first of its kind in Central Asia. This was hosted by the Uzbek government in the Ferghana Valley in the city of Ferghana. And the purpose of it was to essentially codify and move forward the peace declaration that Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan had signed earlier this spring, essentially trying to demarcate all of their borders, which had been disputed since Soviet times and had been the source of conflict. And the hope now is that once we've demarcated and essentially delimited these borders, that'll be a new era of peace in the region and hopefully prosperity as well.
Okay, so these borders have been demarcated.
They're in the process.
But
yeah,
we're in the passive here. Why? What has prompted them to do this? And
so back in 2021 and 2022, there were some pretty deadly clashes between Kyrgyz and Tajik military forces that killed dozens of people, wounded hundreds more, and was really quite a black stain on a region that prides itself on pursuing stability. And so the idea between the peace deal is called the Khujand Declaration, named after the city in Tajikistan where it was signed by the presidents of Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and the Kyrgyz Republic, is to say, hey, these are where our borders are. It was not necessarily clear after the Soviet Union fell because those borders were internal borders to the Soviet Union, and suddenly they became external borders. And so for a long time, they were a source of conflict. And the idea now is to say, hey, these are where the borders are. This is where our people are. This is where our country's land ends, and to be able to kind of build on sharing resources once you know where one country ends and another begins, and to be able to pool and again, share in resources and share in transport with the hope of making the region a bit more prosperous.
Now, is one of the reasons that prompted them to go down this path the fear of the looming shadow of the Russian bear? Because Putin has taken a more active interest in the former Soviet territories.
Well, these countries are pretty lucky, honestly, in that they don't share a border with Russia. So that we can check that off the list. But you're absolutely right that Russia has had an outsized influence in the region, certainly since the fall of the Soviet Union. But one of the things that was remarkable about the Khujand Declaration is that it was done trilaterally without any outside negotiating mediators, certainly not Russia or China, which I think is a pretty significant sign of the Central Asian states exercising their own agency and pursuing their own sovereignty and security to handle matters that are between themselves.
You mentioned China, which has obviously taken a much more active interest in this region as well. And there is, my friend Fred Starr testified before the Senate a few weeks ago about the Caspian Sea as a geopolitical pivot point, and that the Chinese are becoming more interested in it. Is this your sense as well, that China has become much more active in the region?
Well, if we talk about China's Belt and Road Initiative, they began that in Central Asia, in Kazakhstan. That was the first country that was a BRI project country. And so the Chinese have always had a really significant interest in Central Asia, certainly for the last 10, 15 plus years. Now, each Central Asian state's relationships with China, with Beijing, are a little bit different. Some of them have more interest with China. Some of them willing to do more deals with China than others. And so it's not necessarily an even relationship with Beijing across the region. But you mentioned the Caspian. That's absolutely something that China is interested in, and having connectivity from Central Asia to world markets and on to Europe.
And you've written on that extensively.
Exactly. Yeah, their hope is that Central Asia can build out this infrastructure to transport Chinese goods to Europe and to bypass Russia. The Central Asian states hope that they can use that for their own products, for their own resources, to broaden their connectivity as well. And on the second point there, the United States certainly has an interest in helping to facilitate that kind of intra and inter-regional connectivity with Central Asia.
So 2 questions. First, which scenario do you think is more likely? The indigenous scenario or the Chinese influence scenario? And second, is the United States doing enough to protect its own interests in the region?
So on the first one, China has all sorts of transport routes that it can use, including seaborne routes, basically taking large ships, container ships, other kinds, essentially across the Pacific and Indian Ocean to Europe and elsewhere. So they have a pretty cost-effective way to do that. So the middle corridor, I don't think, is their number one play. They'd like to have more routes to transport their goods, but it's not a main consideration for them. The Central Asian states, however, really want better connectivity with Europe, with Turkey, and with the Middle East as well, and not to mention with each other. So I think the Central Asian states are the most motivated to make this multimodal Trans-Caspian route work, which is something that the United States should be interested in. And to your second question there, I don't think the U.S. has done as much as they could have. U.S. firms, it's funny, you talk to Central Asian governments and investment folks there, and they ask, why isn't the U.S. more active? And it's in part because the U.S. government can't direct firms to act in their interest the way China can. And so there's a little bit of a question of project economics that the Central Asian states can help American companies with, but the U.S. government can also do more in facilitating that kind of investment on the U.S. side into the region.
Now, President Trump has not been shy about trying to project what he perceives as American financial and diplomatic military interests abroad. What do you think he should do vis-a-vis Central Asia? Since he is a fairly freewheeling character, he's not really bound by convention. So perhaps he could smash some of these barriers that you've alluded to.
Well, I'd say ask me again in a couple days, Jacob, because we're about to have the C5+1 Presidential Summit in Washington, D.C. between President Trump and the 5 leaders of these Central Asian countries. So the timing of this is really excellent, I would say. This is the first time it'll be held in Washington, D.C. at the presidential level. And so, you talk about President Trump acting in a pragmatic, freewheeling, deal-making kind of fashion. In lots of parts of the world, that's not necessarily been in America's best interest, at least in the short term. But in Central Asia, it absolutely is. The Central Asian states are super pragmatic, want to pursue their own interests ruthlessly in a good way, and to balance their relations with Russia, China, and the rest of the world. And this is a way where Trump's deal-making skills, I think, can be a real positive for American interests here. And we've seen just in the past several months, billions of dollars in deals being agreed between American companies and the governments of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. So I think we're on the right track, and hopefully President Trump can facilitate even more investment and trade deals there.
Now, I know that we have a substantial interest in uranium in Kazakhstan, but what other kinds of deals have we been signing and should we sign?
So the 2 big deals that came out on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly were the American company Wabtec, the train-making locomotive company, selling, I believe it was about $4 billion in locomotives to Kazakhstan to facilitate exactly this kind of middle corridor transport and infrastructure that we're talking about. And the other deal was Uzbekistan buying up to $8 billion of Boeing airplanes. Both of these companies are long-time partners of these countries. But it's interesting, both of these are essentially connectivity projects, having more planes to fly in and out of Tashkent, having more capacity to transport rare earth metals, critical minerals, and containerized goods across the vast Kazakh steppe. I mean, these are things that are helping to open the region to the world and are exactly the kinds of things that American companies and the American government should be thinking about.
Do you think Washington has been a little slow on the uptake about the vibrancy of the region?
I'll give you one example. I was talking to some think tankers in Tashkent just on my recent visit, and the U.S. is really interested in rare earths and critical minerals, and there's even been some MOUs signed between American companies and the government of Uzbekistan. And they said, yeah, no, that's good, but the Chinese have already scooped up most of the best licenses. There's still some sites left, but American firms really need to move more quickly, and the American government, led by the Trump administration, can help, I think, grease the skids, as it were, with the government in Uzbekistan on those licenses, and hopefully to make some of these projects more economical for American companies.
So final question.
Yes.
You get a call from the White House once this interview ends, and they say, Andrew, we need you to come brief President Trump for his upcoming conference. What would you advise him?
I would say it's time to, this is a little bit of a wonky answer, but unleash the power of the Development Finance Corporation. This is something that President Trump has talked about in terms of, a sovereign wealth fund, ways to essentially loosen the restrictions on deploying American capital to strategically important projects. If the U.S. government can put down some equity or financing to make critical minerals and rare earth deals more economical and profitable for American companies, that'll unleash what I hope would be a pretty significant tap in terms of American resources and financing to the region that both get at American interests in securing critical mineral and rare earth supply chains, and also help American firms make a bit of money in Central Asia and get Central Asian countries more interested, more tied to the United States.
Well, Andrew, thank you. This was extremely informative.
Thanks, Jacob. Appreciate it.